Hello, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for the third installment of our Evolution of Mindfulness series, where today we'll be discussing breaking the cycle, how mindfulness and mindfulness-based cognitive therapy reshape mental health. So my name is Frances Sadi, and I am the Associate Director of Non-Degree Programs here at Brown University's School of Professional Studies, where we are proud to offer an ever-expanding portfolio of evidence-based mindfulness programs, including short courses, teacher training certificates, and free masterclasses such as today's webinar. At Brown, we are deeply committed to advancing education that is both intellectually rigorous and personally transformative. Our mindfulness programs, developed in collaboration with the Mindfulness Center at Brown University's School of Public Health, embody this mission, integrating scientific research, contemplative traditions, and practical applications to make mindfulness accessible and impactful in a wide range of settings. So it's truly a pleasure to be here with you today as we continue this exploration into how mindfulness is shaping and reshaping our understanding of health, healing, and human resilience. For those who are new to the series, the Evolution of Mindfulness was created to spotlight influential voices who have helped shape the field of mindfulness, from those who laid its modern foundations to those advancing its future through research, clinical innovation, and public health impact. This series brings together pioneers, scientists, and practitioners who are bridging contemplative traditions with the evolving needs of our current society. So in our first session, we welcomed Jon Kabat-Zinn, whose development of mindfulness-based stress reduction, or MBSR, over 40 years ago helped bring mindfulness into mainstream medicine. And then last month, we were joined by Dr. Richie Davidson, a leading neuroscientist whose groundbreaking research has deepened our understanding of how mindfulness transforms the brain and supports emotional well-being. And today, we are incredibly honored to welcome Dr. Zindel Segal, one of the original co-developers of Mindfulness-Based Cognitive Therapy, or MBCT. Zindel's work could not be more relevant to this moment in time. As we as a society continue to navigate a pressing mental health crisis marked by rising rates of depression, anxiety, burnout, loneliness, and disconnection, MBCT offers something both radical and deeply humane: a structured, evidence-based approach to emotional suffering that centers on awareness, compassion, and choice. For individuals living with recurring depression, MBCT has emerged as a powerful and effective intervention, one that helps people shift their relationship to their difficult thoughts and feelings, and in doing so, reduces the likelihood of relapse. But its potential goes beyond any single diagnosis. In a world marked by stress, burnout, and disconnection, the core practices of MBCT, stillness, curiosity, and presence, offer a grounded and compassionate path forward. Dr. Segal is a distinguished professor of psychology and mood disorders at the University of Toronto and an internationally recognized leader in mindfulness-based mental health care. His research has explored everything from neural markers of relapse prevention to the digital delivery of mindfulness programs. His TEDx talk on mindfulness in psychiatry has been viewed over 1 million times, and his most recent book, Better in Every Sense, examines how sensory awareness can help disrupt unhelpful mental habits. And we are also thrilled to be joined today by my colleague and friend, Dr. Shufeng Sun, who will be facilitating the conversation with Dr. Segal. So Dr. Sun is the Associate Director of the Mindfulness Center at Brown University and an assistant professor at the Brown School of Public Health. She's a licensed clinical psychologist whose research focuses on how mindfulness and digital health interventions can support individuals affected by trauma, marginalization, and early adversity. Her work not only advances the science of mindfulness, but it ensures that it is accessible and inclusive for those who need it most. So before we dive into the dialogue today, just a few quick housekeeping notes. First, today's webinar is being recorded, and we will make sure to send out a link to the recording later this week, along with additional resources on our mindfulness programs offered here at Brown. You can also find the recording, this recording, as well as others from the speaker series on our Brown Mindfulness YouTube channel. I can drop a link in the chat after this. Second, we invite you to fully engage with today's talk, whether that means taking notes, reflecting on what resonates with you, or simply listening deeply. If you have any questions, please do use the Q&A feature found at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will make sure to leave time for discussion at the end. We do have a large number of attendees today. We have over 500 of you joining us. So even if your question is not addressed specifically today, do know that we do read all of the questions and comments after the talk to get a sense of what's being said and what questions and themes are emerging. So we do encourage you to write to us and give us your feedback. And finally, while we know we can only scratch the surface in a session like this, our hope is that today's conversation sparks insight, curiosity, and perhaps a deeper commitment to integrating mindfulness into your personal or professional lives. And with that, it is my great honor to welcome both Dr. Zindel Segal and Dr. Shufeng Sun. Thank you both for being here today and for the work that you do to support healing and transformation in so many people's lives.
Thanks, Francis. It's a real pleasure.
Thank you, Fran, for the kind introduction, and thank you, Zindel, for taking your time of the day to be with us. So just for those of you in the audience, it warms my heart to know that there's over 500 people listening this conversation. And to give people just a little bit orientation, in the first 40 minutes or so, Zindel and I will just have a conversation about MBCT, and I'm really curious to hear about both your personal journey, Zindel, as well as a researcher. I have some, dying questions around the research and evidence, as well as integrating those into clinical practice. And I will also try to integrate some of the pre-submitted questions from our audience into the conversation. And we'll open up for live questions. We'll try to address one or two towards the end before we wrap up. So welcome again, Zindel. And we have been just really incredibly fortunate to welcome some of the most influential voices in the field of mindfulness, including John Kabat-Zinn, Richard Davidson, and now you, Zindel. While you and others are known for your pioneering research and groundbreaking programs, I'm really curious about your personal journey because that is just as inspiring. And at the end of the day, you are not just thought leaders, you're people with your personal experiences, stories, and defining moments that led you here. So to start, I'd love to hear about your own path. What first drew you to mindfulness, and how did it evolve into the work that you do today?
Thanks, Shifang. I haven't met you before, but I'm really looking forward to having a chance for us to discuss and dive into these issues. I think you're starting with a very, very important question, which is essentially so much of our program talks about mindfulness, and yet there are many different ways of moving into delivering mindfulness in the context of mental health care. And so my path in did not start with a sort of commitment to meditation first and foremost. My path in started at a time when the field was trying to understand depression, and there were a number of opposing camps that had pretty firm ideas about what depression was and what it wasn't. In biological psychiatry, depression was seen as a neurobiological disorder that needed to be best treated with medication. And so we're talking around 1983, 84, 85. And on the psychological side, there were also efforts to understand depression through psychological processes that could be more malleable and adapted to help people recover and stay well. And in the midst of that, there was a way of trying to integrate these views that came from early randomized clinical trials that showed therapies like cognitive therapy and interpersonal psychotherapy able to teach people skills that when embedded in a kind of wellness framework that people could take on for themselves, allow them to be as protected from relapse as if they were continuing to take antidepressant medication. And this was a very important breakthrough at the level of our models of depression, because what it suggested was that antidepressant medication can protect people as long as people are continuing to take the medication. But it's possible that people can also internalize specific types of skills that, if they were to be practiced rigorously enough, could protect them equally well. And it wasn't, these skills are better than antidepressant medication, or antidepressant medication is better than these skills. It was coming to terms with the fact that for many people, antidepressant medication was not a long-term solution, either because of side effect profiles, either because of something called tachyphylaxis, which is where the medication that initially worked really well kind of runs out of steam and doesn't work any longer. The concerns of women who were pregnant and perhaps wanted to come off antidepressant medication. So there was a large swath of people who could be served by having an alternative means of helping them manage their depression in the long term. Now, I think it's really important to stress that we're not talking about treating acute phase depression. The treatment of acute phase depression was, I'm not sure if it's an exaggeration to say it, but was sort of being taken care of by either antidepressants or therapies that were designed to deal with depression. It's really the longer tail of depression that many, many people live with because of its recognition as a chronic disease, a chronic management problem, that people continue to relapse, that relapse increases risk of subsequent episodes significantly. And that the opportunity to allow people to look after themselves and participate in their long-term management through learning skills was really a burning question at the time. And then, of course, the question is, what skills? Mm-hmm. And so our work tried to answer that question by suggesting that learning the practice of mindfulness meditation in the context of a structured program that provided people with a framework for understanding the workings of their own mind and the way in which they could get some freedom from the constraints that a sort of depression mind can put on them was something worth pursuing. And I realize I'm answering your question at the level of MBCT, not my own personal journey, but if I can just switch back to my own personal journey, I dabbled with meditation when I was 16, 18, sort of a romantic engagement with TM for a while, with other more, let's say, exotic versions of it. But it kind of lost me because the claims that people who were meditating and these systems of meditation made became increasingly far-fetched. Mm-hmm. So with TM moving into special powers, special states, and all these things, they just really failed to capture me in a way that continued to motivate me to kind of adhere. And then I went into McGill at the time and pursued a much more empirically sort of focused way of understanding phenomena and through science. And then eventually ended up in Toronto working in a cognitive therapy unit, which specialized in the treatment of depression. And a feature of cognitive therapy had to do with skills, how to teach people skills to help them become their own therapists, to internalize certain ways of understanding the relationship to thinking, understanding the relationship to appraisals and interpretation. And these skills were very, very helpful. And in the psychotherapy field in general, there was an understanding that as people can take these skills on board for themselves, as they can learn them either in the context of a therapeutic relationship or in the context of specific skills or interventions that they can participate in, they can have a better capacity to look after themselves. So then the next question is, how did I jump from cognitive therapy skills to mindfulness meditation. And I think that that's it's a very interesting question, because what it required was a kind of turning around of a number of ways of understanding the phenomena that we were working with, and discarding a kind of cognitive conceptual lens and moving into a lens that was much more experiential, much more sensory based, and much more open to knowing things from a perspective of awareness and unfolding, rather than a perspective of prediction and certainty. And I will say that that process took me at least 3 years. It wasn't a breakthrough moment where, the first time I practiced mindfulness or went to a retreat, like everything fell into place. It took 3 years because of the resistance that I felt to having to leave one model and accept another model. And in that process, it was very helpful that I had good colleagues like John Teasdale and Mark Williams that I worked with, and that we actually spent time with John Kabat-Zinn at the UMass Medical Center, sitting in on his classes and being very puzzled and a bit bewildered by watching him work and trying to figure out what he was actually doing, and then translating that back into terms that we could make sense of. So it was a rapprochement over time that deepened as our own practice of mindfulness deepened. But I guess what I'm trying to say is I came into it through a very different door, but eventually landed in this exact place that you described in our introduction.
Thank you for sharing that. Really wonderful and powerful to hear. I remember back in the days when I was in graduate school training and learning about different models of, CBT and mindfulness. One of the things that struck me personally was that, in mindfulness practice or mindfulness-based therapy, instead of saying, patients have these thoughts that are irrational, for example, and to be corrected, it's a much more humane approach and much more curious approach in terms of let's look at it together and see how it, unfolds in the moment for you. How does it work for you? So it's, like you were saying, much more less predictive and more experiential in that way. And I think it takes, a lot of courage to go that route, to not be the authority in the room. So thanks so much for sharing that. I'm really curious, it's been more than, certainly more than a decade in terms of the research aspect of MBCT. And one of the most remarkable and compelling aspects of MBCT is the research and the evidence behind it, especially in preventing relapse in depression. Could you share some of the most exciting and perhaps most surprising aspect of research findings that have emerged over the years on MBCT for depression?
I think the research pivot is very, very important, because if you look at MBSR, John's work is sort of working from the outside in, with his background in microbiology and working as a postdoc at UMass, and then deciding to form the stress reduction clinic. It was an insight from outside the walls of the academy that was allowed to germinate and flower eventually. My work was more from the inside out. I was in the Department of Psychiatry, a conservative department of psychiatry at the time that really believed in psychopharmacology and psychodynamic approaches. And so to suggest that there may be something of value in teaching people how to practice mindfulness meditation in the context of mood disorders was seen as either foolhardy, naive. Someone said to me, career suicide. They use that term. And so really the currency that we used to try to make our case was evidence from randomized clinical trials. But we focused on one particular population in which there was wide recognition that these people were not receiving the type of care that they required. So when we think about people who are have recovered or are in remission from depression or may have residual depressive symptoms, but they're essentially out of the main acute episode, these are people who are not sick enough to require retreatment, but they're not well enough to be considered okay. Let's move on to the next case because this person has been dealt with. And so they were people who, from a treatment perspective, were seen as having a clinical need, but there weren't very many interventions. And I think even though MBCT had been around for something like 30 years, that very same strategy is in play with other interventions. The case for psychedelics, for psilocybin and for other psychedelic interventions are being used in patients who have treatment-resistant depression. So another group for whom interventions seem to be lacking, and then maybe opens up minds to like, let's see if doing this a different way can make a difference. And so that was our context 30 years ago, where people were saying, well, we don't really know what to do, and relapse rates are high, and there's the possibility of building a more sort of chronic presentation of the disorder. And so, well, let's open up our minds and see whether this program of structured mindfulness meditation and yoga and training can help people step out and prevent relapse. And so I think the first couple of studies that we did really addressed that in a way that could speak back to departments of psychiatry and help to shed some of the baggage carried by meditation from the 60s, where it was seen as more of a breakthrough, insight-oriented practice that once you managed to break through, your depression was gone, or you were free, or you were liberated, as opposed to this more sort of methodical, practice-intensive way of helping you develop a different relationship to your symptoms, rather than expecting the elimination of whatever symptoms you might have, and around that being able to build a life that could be lived more fully rather than in the shadow of mood disorder. And so those were the initial steps that I think that we took that really helped MBCT. And then the other things that happened importantly early on were replication studies, so that this was not seen as just something coming out of the work that John and Mark and I did, but other people conducting studies using our same protocol. We're getting similar results in the area of preventing relapse and treating residual depressive symptoms, I would say. And then others in the field, really took over and had a number of ways in which this work was being extended to other populations that maybe had more of a anxiety presentation, dealing with postpartum depression. And I think that, that in a sense was an important springboard that really helped us.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for sharing that context and the need for both evidence-based research and using the gold standard of randomized controlled trials, and to really understand the efficacy and the importance of replication in science. I'm really curious in terms of, both as a scientist and as a clinician, in terms of depression treatment, but also mental health more broadly in terms of mechanisms or doorways per se, how MBCT works through to improve mental health outcomes. What does the research say, and what do you find as salient in your clinical observations as well?
I mean, that's like a very, very important question, because the recognition of the need is so great, and yet the means of delivery have really expanded. I remember giving a talk maybe 15 years ago, and I had an iPhone. I pulled out my iPhone. I was so happy and proud. If you go onto the iPhone, there's a health tile, and if you click on the health tile, it showed that there were different things that you could do to promote good health. One of them was sleep, and one of them was taking steps. And then they had this brand new tile, and it was called mindfulness. And it's like, wow, mindfulness has arrived because billions of people have iPhones. And yet, I think what your question is asking for is like, what happens when we try to go underneath the label of mindfulness? What is mindfulness in the context of these programs? And initially, my understanding and in my training, in my experience, in my practice, um, the framework really had to do with um, asking people to practice mindfulness for very long periods of time, 35, 40 minutes, the mindful stretching, the yoga, body scans, sitting meditation. And there was almost an expectation that if people did this, it would be correlated with the magnitude of benefit that they would receive. And it kind of made sense in that way. But I'd say over the last 10 or 15 years in gathering evidence from all kinds of programs, not just MBCT, MBSR, and other programs, compassion-based training programs as well, people don't practice that often. Only outliers in these groups practice that often. And if they do practice often in these groups, then they don't continue to practice once the groups stop meeting. And this was very sobering because even though, teachers, instructors, and myself, we can continue to practice regularly in different ways, we had to become aware of the fact that for many people, this was a very tough ask to make the time. And then also hearing from people who had access to the multiple mindfulness apps that are available. So, make it so easy that it's just on people's phones, make it so easy that it's just at their fingertips. Many people would say, I tried this and I stopped because it wasn't working for me, or they try it for a week. And, you can look at user data from some of the most popular apps and see that engagement drops off fairly quickly after about 10 days. And so we needed to have some kind of reconciliation with these ideas and the possibility that maybe the massed practice model that we are helping people to engage with in our programs is missing something. And one thing to remember is that we're talking about mindfulness, but these programs are multimodal. There's so much going on. There's the fact that people are meeting as a group. There's a kind of de-shaming and destigmatization of people hearing others' stories. There's a lot of support that goes on in these groups, a kind of way in which people are, offering others good intentions for their own recovery and engagement. There's, some structured cognitive therapy, psychoeducation about, well, what is depression and what is you, and helping people see things that they may have personalized and blamed themselves for. And then there's the practice of mindfulness. So mindfulness sits alongside these other components. And I don't think that we know definitively. I can't say definitively to someone coming into the group, if you only do this, every 6 days a week out of 7, then you will find yourself reducing your risk for relapse. But what I do know, and this is something that's changed in my own outlook, is that I've come increasingly to believe that instead of the intensity of practice, in other words, the massed practice over the 8 weeks, that we still do ask. I think there's still good reasons for that. I'm always looking for people who have found a way to introduce a dailiness of some form of practice into their lives, doing something that allows them to ground themselves in the middle of a moment, that allows themselves to engage with the sensory world, that allows themselves to maybe even do a 3-minute breathing space as a way of recognizing this other dimension that they can tap into. But that doesn't necessarily require, the intensity of practice, and that this is something they can carry with them once the classes and their structure and the groups have ended. And I'm thinking increasingly that this is something that we need to teach to. Now, there may be skeptics who say you need the backdrop of the 40 minutes in order to make the 3 minutes or even the 1 minute or the breath check-in meaningful? And maybe that's true. So I think that's still an open question. But for me, it's better to have participation of people doing something for themselves every day than people who agree, yes, this is really important. I can do it on a Saturday and a Sunday when I'm, able to find more time. But during the week, it's like too busy or I'm too checked out. And that's kind of as far as I've gotten. Um, there have been papers that have been written about mechanisms, and some of them are actually similar to the mechanisms that seem to supercharge psychotherapy when it works really well.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for sharing your observations and what you shared about so many things that are happening in an MBCT class is both very true and profound because there are often multiple active ingredients that are at work. And also, like, when we do reviews, what we found is that there's no consistent mediators or moderators, really. Those are mechanisms of change per se. And what you're sharing in terms of the engaging the population is really important because without engagement, none of those changes can
Yeah,
happen.
yeah.
If people just stay outside of the door instead of stepping into the experience, whether in the class or within their own experience in the moment. And this is actually perfectly, you know, um, transitions into the next question I want to ask you. When we run clinical trials, and a lot of the trials that we're running are especially focused on engaging diverse populations, and in my research, populations that have been affected by stigma, trauma, and marginalization, including young people and adults as well. And one of the things that we've been hearing from people, and particularly from the younger generation, is that they feel as if the practice is too long and burdensome. And the feedback we've been getting is that people want shorter practice and they sometimes prefer or relate better to informal practices since people have busy lives. And I can certainly understand that not everyone either have the time or either the interest or the level of commitment to make, 30 to 40, 45 minutes daily time for practice. So I'm curious about, this sort of just goes deeper into the conversation that we've been having on how to engage people who would like shorter practices and also just making mindfulness more available for broader populations, whether it's for those of us who would like to engage in more formal practices daily, as well as people who relate better to informal practices and want to have a touch of mindfulness in their daily life, but don't want mindfulness to define everything that they do, for example.
Yeah, I'm thinking, who am I going to anger with my answer? Um, but Shufan, I don't think this is a question for participants. I think it's a question for us as teachers. Because my experience has been in these groups, people always ask to shorten the practice. If it's a 40-minute body scan, can I do it 20 minutes twice a day? Can I do it 10 minutes 4 times a day? It's not unusual for people to negotiate in these ways. And so for me, I think the answer comes back to, first of all, the teacher, the instructor needs to understand what the practice can offer. Now, for some people, the practice can offer a relaxation, a reduction in arousal, a way of dealing with overwhelm. And this can come fairly quickly. You close your eyes, you're engaging parasympathetic nervous system responses that are associated with sleep and rest. But as an instructor, you also probably know that, or we also probably know that underneath the relaxation and underneath the kind of stopping the chattering mind, there is this capacity to investigate with compassion, curiosity, where the mind goes, and to have a different relationship to narratives that come up for us time and again. and to develop a different relationship, a relationship of befriending, acquaintanceship, or at least recognition and labeling. Oh, here we go again. Oh, here you are. And that there is a way of freeing yourself sometimes from the grip of these narratives. So, as the instructor, you know that, you've experienced that, your training and your practice has maybe articulated this for you in the way that you relate to your own mind. And so we see these features as part of a kind of way that all minds work, the sort of universal mind notion. But then you're being asked by someone in front of you, can I skip some of that and just do this, once a day, or do it for 2 or 3 minutes? And it's easy to say that, no, you can't, because in order to do it for 3 minutes, you need to taste what 40 minutes feels like. Or you can say, of course you can, because if I let you do this, then you'll be more likely to come back to the next session next week. And guess what? That's probably the most important thing. And so it's a question for the instructor. And I think these are very idiosyncratic decisions that get made based on knowing enough about the person in front of you, and also based on knowing enough about the process that you're trying to encourage people to step into themselves. And so sometimes, this comes up, for example, in the body scan, where people might say, oh, the body scan was just like amazing. I fell asleep after 10 minutes. And and that's how I'm going to use it. And so, of course, there's benefit here. This person is using it, and sleep is important. How do we as instructors suggest to them that, yes, this is good and this is reliable, but how do we invite them to maybe see whether they're interested in investigating a little bit beyond that, when sleep isn't the only thing that can come out of the practice? And so I think it's much more of this sort of gestation for the instructor to try to understand what's available and how much of that can be asked or required. Because there are all kinds of ways of engaging in briefer practices, everyday mindfulness, 3-minute breathing spaces,
Mm.
those kinds of things. So that's sort of how I think about answering the question.
Mhm, mhm. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, a lot for those of us who teach to think about, and also to examine our own assumptions in terms of, are there ways that we've ourselves favor, for example, that
Yes.
may come across in classroom and then may inevitably make some students or attendees feel judged one way or another, for example. Or if we just leave people to their own devices and say, you know, 3 minute is fine, informal is fine, you don't have to do formal practices at all. What may be some of the consequences for the class if we, use that approach instead? So, yeah, thanks for sharing. And I sort of want to go back to, we've been talking about this question related to people from diverse backgrounds, and sort of in a related way, I think when we serve people who come into the door, whether from diverse populations, backgrounds, or just their diverse experiences, and how that shows up in people's symptoms or struggles can be different. And we also know that people tend to struggle in the real world, comorbidities or coexisting conditions. It might not just be depression, it could be anxiety and PTSD symptoms at play as well. And we also know that many populations or subpopulations might not have, sort of this cookie cutter standard clinical depression symptoms when they're in the classroom, and they might have subclinical depressive struggles, but may feel a sense of stress and overwhelm. I remember it was 2 years ago. This was in the context of research. I was interviewing a pregnant woman, and talking about experiences related to stress and depression. And one of the feedback that she gave me was that, in the clinical questionnaires that we use that measure depression, when she was checking, she doesn't have those clinical symptoms because she wouldn't describe her experience in those way. But what she would describe is a fundamental sense of overwhelm. And that sense of overwhelm also affect her level of functioning. So if you look at her functioning, it might, seem in a similar way, it's as it is impaired by someone who's affected by depression, for example, but she wouldn't qualify in terms of clinical depression. So I'm curious about your thoughts in terms of how MBCT might support people who are navigating, a range of emotional distress and emotional noises of, just how our modern life often affect us.
I think that MBCT was developed around this notion of a diagnosable disorder, and it was evaluated around that reference point. But inside of MBCT, there are ways in which the ideas really are pointing to universal tendencies of the mind to engage in certain um, maneuvers. And those maneuvers, I think, also underlie some of these more sort of transdiagnostic or non-specific presentations that you're describing, where they may not meet thresholds for a diagnosis, but they might find that they're impaired in other ways. They may be able to function, but their lives, in a sense, are potentially stripped away from experiences that are rewarding or meaningful. And so there is a version of MBCT that Mark Williams has developed. I think it's called Mindfulness for Life,
Mhm.
where some of the general concepts are communicated without tagging them to a specific diagnosis. So, for example, I can just think of three things that if people were able to recognize and watch the mind in operation while doing this, they might be able to find some relief. So the first one is recognizing automaticity, the automatic way in which we are um, compelled by mental habits, ideas, expectations to work in ways that are very efficient, that prioritize, thinking and prioritize problem solving, and prevent us from stepping away from that into realms where discovery, surprise, and not knowing are much more likely to show up. I think judgments and comparison, discrepancy reduction between a mind that sees oneself as needing something else that one doesn't have, and how to get there and how to plot and strategize how to get more of that, to see that in action, and to see that one can have a relationship to those kinds of thoughts and ideas. And then I think the last one has to do with sort of choice and agency, even in the practices, to provide ourselves with a chance to decide what type of engagement we want to have, rather than feeling like we have to follow a certain regimen that's been pre-laid out for us. So emphasizing these things not in a way that is tied to a diagnosis, but in a way that allows people to see that this is the way everyone's mind works. And this is one of the sort of, I think, important insights in the Buddhist way of understanding mental functioning, which is that all our minds work in these ways. Some people are able to see the workings more clearly, others are not able to see them as clearly. But once we achieve greater levels of clarity through practice, through engagement, and also through setting our intentions to be with our minds and to be open to what gets revealed, then there's, I think, more of an opening um, that shows up, and there's a greater choicefulness inside of that.
Thank you for sharing and highlighting those underpinnings that work not just for depression or one singular diagnosis, but also just how the human mind, how the tendencies that our minds have that sometimes can lead to suffering. I want to have ask more questions, but I am also aware of time and
Mm.
want to give the audience a chance, and for us to address some of the live questions. So I guess to start, we have a question from Hisham. I would be interested if Dr. Siegel could elaborate on the differences between MBSR and MBCT, the outside-in approach versus the inside-out. Thank you.
Uh, Outside in and inside out are not really related to MBCT and MBSR. It's just that John was able to make a case for MBSR by bringing ideas into the medical center, whereas I was already working in a department of psychiatry and tried to see if I could get these ideas fleshed out more broadly and accepted by a skeptical psychiatry. But MBSR and MBCT, we learned tremendously from the generosity of John Kabat-Zinn, Saki Santorelli, Ferris Urbanowski, and others that we sat in on groups as they were teaching. And then we would caucus, myself, John, and Mark, we would caucus and try to understand what they were doing in terms of our frames of reference as cognitive psychologists, as clinical psychologists as well. And MBSR and MBCT on one level could be seen as having tremendous amounts of overlap because the practices are pretty much identical, because we follow an 8-week structure, because we adhere to the same requirements of practice both for instructors and for participants. Or NBCT and NBSR could be seen as somewhat divergent because our framework essentially really tries to focus on understanding depression mind, the tendencies of aversion, the tendencies of judgment, comparison, and perseveration that people with depression generally find themselves engaging in, and ways of helping people to step back from that. So our goal, if you will, inside MBCT is much more modest. I think the goals inside MBSR are much more broad spectrum and try to teach people a way of relating to all their experience, whether it's chronic pain, depression, anxiety, other medical or mental health issues. The approach is somehow that this work will be revelatory and it will attach itself to the problems that people have. So in those ways, it's a little different. MBCT also features a lot of, well, not a lot, but it features a fair amount of psychoeducation about how depressive symptoms show up together as a syndrome, and that the tendency of people to personalize some of these symptoms as personal weaknesses. And also, we introduce a 3-minute breathing space, which is something that people can take with them once the course is over. So those, I think, are the, probably the biggest differentiator is the intent of the focus. Ours is more like a spotlight on depression, and I think MBSR is much more of a floodlight on a broad spectrum of difficulties that present themselves, but the practices are the same. They just serve a different endpoint.
Thank you for sharing and elaborating more on the differences. I think a few of our audience have asked that. And someone also asked in terms of the lens of the practice that we've been talking about. So the question was more related to, when we shorten the practices, are we making it more accessible to the people, or are we adhering to cultural premises? Smartphone mean use time is a lot more than 40 minutes. So yeah, there's question about digital device use as well. And I actually had an original question related to with the how the digital landscape has been evolving. How do you think MBCT or mindfulness in general fit into that? And do you see it as something that we can integrate mindfulness more into people's daily lives? Or are there ways of doing it really with the intention of mindfulness rather than people being, sometimes lost in the doom scrolls that can
Yeah.
easily happen?
Yeah. I mean, this is really, it's a very important question. It's a super relevant question. I remember I was on a panel with Jack Kornfield, and this question was being asked with people anxiously wanting to know if people practice mindfulness through a digital app, is it somehow degrading the quality of the practice? And Jack was sort of like, he kind of laughed and he said, people here in the West have a romantic view of mindfulness, but what they don't realize is that in these countries that support temples and support active monk communities, that people go to these temples for all kinds of reasons. They'll go to find out winning lottery numbers. They'll go to find a way of being excused for bad behavior. They'll go for things that are very pedestrian, but we see anyone walking through the gates of these temples as practicing like the authentic version of mindfulness. And he said in the West, the intention of why people are using digital supports or platforms for mindfulness very, very important. And I think we have to recognize that there are more and more people that are accessing content digitally. And for example, our efforts to develop a digital version of MBCT, which we did, was driven in part by the realization that as much as MBCT is valorized and included in national treatment guidelines, it's very hard to find an MBCT teacher, full stop. And the MBC teacher training program that Brown offers is one of the only ones in the country to make this available and to increase the capacity of MBCT teachers. So if you're only going to access MBCT or mindfulness informed clinical care in person in a group, you're going to be out of luck, because unless you're living in a very large city, you're not going to find it. So going online is already one step into a digital universe. And then having supports for that practice through digital platforms is yet another step. So it comes back to intention and how well these apps are developed. And some of them are developed from a place where the practice of mindfulness, I think, is emphasized more as a kind of relaxation, as a kind of bliss machine. You'll have nice music, you'll have colors, you'll have screens that are engaging. And I think others are developed in concert with established mindfulness teachers who really allow people to experience digitally the kind of practice, instruction, and guidance that they might receive if they were on a retreat.
Thank you for sharing. And the intention piece is so important. And maybe the blissfulness, it can be, a good advertising tool in terms of getting people in, but we would be dishonest if we are telling people that they're only experiencing relaxation and joy. And, often the experience can be quite the opposite, or, really inviting a full range of human experience.
Yeah.
I want to ask one last question for our audience. I know many of our audience are practitioners and professionals or therapists themselves, and who are exploring mindfulness as their careers develop and evolve. So, what suggestions or advice, words of wisdom, would you offer to someone who's just beginning to bridge that gap in terms of being a mindfulness practitioner and wanting to become a trained MBCT facilitator?
Um, yeah, there are a lot of ways of stepping into the field. I think that one of the one of the differentiators really should be, what type of people would you like to work with? If you're interested in working with clinical populations, then I think there needs to be some type of um, training and exposure to holding um, clinical care alongside mindfulness-based practices. And what that means is understanding, um, the nature of clinical disorders and having some capacity yourself for working with people that have those kinds of presentations. Now, of course, it's not a brick wall that separates that group from people who, let's say, are showing up with stress in the workplace, or people that are showing up with, being overwhelmed because they're caregivers, but otherwise they don't have, sort of diagnostic presentations. But it is important in order to understand that some of these disorders sort of shape the narratives in the mind in a certain way, and that those kinds of narratives can be very influential in keeping symptoms in place. Now, if on the other hand, maybe you're a mental health practitioner who wants to incorporate mindfulness interventions in your clinical practice, and maybe you want to turbocharge what you're offering your patients by giving them these other capacities. And so the thing that I would say there is you need to start your own practice of mindfulness. These things can't be taught anecdotally or through a narrative um, mode of transmission. You need to be able to speak about them from your own experience of what it's like to stop and to be able to develop a relationship to the things that are, troubling to you in your life or to you in your own mind. And we got some pushback from our publisher and even from the field when we published the first MBCT treatment manual, when we said explicitly, in order to teach MBCT, you need to have your own mindfulness practice. Otherwise, don't call it MBCT. And this was sort of like, well, it's like psychoanalysis, where you're saying that in order to practice psychoanalysis, you yourself have to go through analysis, and that takes years. And it was like, not really. If you understand what's going on here, there's a way in which you very quickly run out of a runway for your ideas if all you're doing is talking about them from a place of having read a manual or having read a book or having read an article. To guide people in their own exploration, these are places you yourself will have had to have gone in order to find a language that is inviting, that is opening, that is curious, and that just comes from practice. So I think on both of these sides, knowing the population that you want to serve and how prepared you are, and then also if you're already serving a population, how prepared you are on the mindfulness side to bring some of those ideas in to have an experiential encounter.
Thank you for sharing that. Really important. And I think in today's world, especially with the shortage of mental health services and the burden that mental health professionals are experiencing,
Mm,
mindfulness could also offer a way for us to taking care of ourselves and holding a space for the professional while you're sitting in the room with your clients. It's
yeah,
equally.
yeah.
Um, I think we can continue to have this conversation for hours, but we are at the hour. And thank you so much, Zindel, for all the important sharings with us today. It's so relevant and critical in the time that we live in. And I want to give Fran a a chance to summarize, as well as I think she has some wonderful news about the Browns program that she would like to share with the audience as well.
Thank you, Shifang. It's been a real pleasure.
Likewise.
Yes. Thank you so much, Zindel and Shufang, for such a thoughtful and inspiring conversation. And thank you to everyone who joined us today, whether you're new to mindfulness or have been exploring this work for years. We really are just so appreciative that you made space to join us today. And I am mindful of time. I did drop a link to next month's webinar. We'd love to have you join us if that works for you. I also, if you have a brief moment, I'm going to launch a poll just to get some feedback on the mindfulness speaker series so far. So let me just do that now. It's just 3 brief questions if you have a moment. And as I mentioned, we'll be sending it out an email later this week with the link to the recording. in case you weren't able to get all of it, or want to go back and listen to it again. It'll also be publicly available on our YouTube channel, so you can share it with friends or families or colleagues as you'd like. And then, lastly, thank you for filling out the poll. By the way, I'm going to leave it open just for a little bit longer, and give folks a chance to answer. Lastly, I just wanted to say that if today's talk sparked your curiosity, whether for yourself or for the work with others, we encourage you to explore our MBCT programs at Brown. I've added some links to the chat, but they will also in the follow-up email, you'll be able to find out more. We do still have room in our spring MBCT 8-week classes that are starting up next week. So we'd love to have you join that. The summer classes are also posted. But then, yeah, if you're interested in exploring potentially becoming an MBCT teacher trainer, we have a teacher's training certificate program that you can find more information online. And you can also sign up to meet one-on-one with our teacher trainers that are wonderful. So thank you again, everyone, for making space. I'm going to stop the poll and have a wonderful rest of your week. Thank you again, Zindel and Shufeng. Take care. Bye, everyone.
Take care, everyone. Be well.